Nick Nwokedi grew up in the quiet town of Umuoji, nestled in Anambra State. His family lived modestly, relying on his father's tailoring business and his mother's small provisions shop to make ends meet. Despite their humble means, Nick's parents had one unshakable belief: education was the key to a better life. They poured everything they had into their son's schooling, and Nick never disappointed. He was a star student, winning numerous awards and accolades throughout his primary and secondary education. His crowning achievement came when he graduated as the best student in his secondary school, earning a full scholarship to Edo State University. The news was celebrated across the entire community, with people saying, "Nick will surely make it big." The night before his departure, his mother sat with him in their small living room, lit by a dim kerosene lamp. "Nick, remember who you are," she said, her voice firm yet affectionate. "You're destined for greatness, but stay humble, work hard, and don't let anything distract you." Nick nodded. "Mama, I won't let you down. I'll make you and Papa proud." The next morning, with a few clothes packed into a small suitcase and a heart full of dreams, Nick boarded a bus to Edo State University. Nick's first impression of the university was awe-inspiring. The campus was bustling with life, its buildings grand and modern. Students zipped by in shiny cars, chatting on phones and carrying themselves with an air of confidence he had never encountered in Umuoji. "This is it," Nick thought as he stepped into his first lecture hall, clutching a leather-bound notebook his father had bought him as a parting gift. For the first few weeks, Nick was determined to stand out. He always arrived early to lectures, sat in the front row, and answered questions with confidence. However, he soon noticed something peculiar. A significant number of his classmates rarely attended lectures. Instead, they seemed to spend their days at parties, lounging at cafes, or hosting elaborate social events. Yet when test results were released, many of these same students had scores far higher than his. One day after class, Nick approached his lecturer, Dr. Oladell, a man known for his impeccable suits and stern demeanor. "Good afternoon, sir," Nick greeted, bowing slightly out of respect. "Yes, young man?" Dr. Oladell asked, barely looking up from the papers on his desk. "Sir, I wanted to ask about my recent test score," Nick began cautiously. "I reviewed the material thoroughly, and I'm certain I answered the questions correctly, but my grade was lower than I expected." Dr. Oladell sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Nick, let me give you some advice. Focus less on grades and more on making connections. This university isn't just about academics. It's about understanding the system." Nick frowned, confused. "The system, sir?" "Yes," Dr. Oladell said, his tone sharp. "Some students have certain privileges. Life isn't fair, Mr. Nwokedi, and this institution reflects that. Learn to adapt." Nick left the office feeling disillusioned. Over time, the truth became glaringly obvious. The students with the most money held all the cards. They drove sleek cars, wore designer clothes, and had access to resources Nick couldn't even dream of. They didn't need to study. Their wealth opened doors and granted them privileges Nick couldn't attain through hard work alone. Worse still, the most beautiful girls on campus gravitated toward these wealthy students, forming cliques that seemed untouchable. Nick couldn't help but feel invisible. His simple clothes and unassuming background made him a nobody in the eyes of his peers. One evening, as Nick sat in his dorm room, his roommate, Danladi, burst in, laughing as he tossed his car keys on the table. "Nick, why do you always bury your head in books?" Danladi asked, slumping onto the bed. "Because that's how I succeed," Nick replied tersely. Danladi chuckled. "In this school, success isn't in the books, my friend. It's in who you know, how you dress, and what you drive." Nick stared at him. "So are you saying all my hard work means nothing?" "I'm saying," Danladi replied, "hard work is good, but connections and cash, they're better." Nick's frustration grew. He had come to Edo State University believing that his brilliance would set him apart, only to find that the rules of the game were entirely different. One day, while walking to class in his modest dressing, he saw a very beautiful young lady named Priska, who was also walking to class. She had long, silky hair that shimmered under the morning sun, and her eyes sparkled with a quiet intelligence. She wore a fitted blouse and a pair of stylish jeans, exuding a confident, effortless charm. Nick, as usual, was dressed in a simple shirt and slacks. nothing that could stand out in the sea of well-dressed students. Summoning every ounce of courage, he decided to approach her. He quickened his steps and caught up to her, forcing a smile. "Hey, Priska, how's your day going?" he asked, his voice a little unsure. She looked up at him, her lips curling into a smile. "Oh, hi, Nick. I'm doing well. How about you?" They walked side by side toward the lecture hall, engaging in small talk about their courses and the university. To Nick's surprise, Priska seemed genuinely interested in their conversation. They laughed over some shared jokes, and the more they spoke, the more comfortable they became around each other. By the time they reached the classroom, Nick felt like he had made a real connection. Over the next week, they met a few more times, often walking to class together and exchanging pleasantries during breaks. They even started sitting next to each other in some classes. Nick couldn't deny the growing connection he felt, and he began to look forward to seeing her every day. But then, things started to change. After their fourth meeting, Priska's responses began to get shorter. She would give him polite smiles, but wouldn't engage in the same level of conversation they once had. When Nick tried to ask her about an assignment in one of their shared courses, she seemed distracted, offering only brief answers. By the end of the week, Priska had stopped greeting him altogether. Nick assumed she was busy with schoolwork or perhaps just preoccupied with other matters. But when he tried calling her the following weekend, his calls went unanswered. He didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to her being too busy. But when it happened again and again, confusion began to seep in. Days passed, and his calls remained unanswered. Even in class, she avoided making eye contact. Nick was left in a state of uncertainty, unsure of what had gone wrong. One afternoon, he found himself waiting at the entrance of their lecture hall, determined to confront her. He had to know why she had stopped talking to him. As the students filed out of the class, Nick spotted Priska among the crowd, heading toward the door. His heart raced as he stepped forward, blocking her path just as she was about to walk out. "Priska, wait," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. She halted, her gaze meeting his for the first time in days. Her expression was polite but distant. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Nick asked, his tone not demanding but sincere. Priska hesitated, her eyes darting around as though looking for an escape. Finally, she nodded, stepping slightly to the side. "I don't understand," Nick began, trying to keep his voice calm. "We were talking, we were getting along, and then suddenly, you stopped responding to me. I've called you several times, but you didn't pick up. What happened?" Priska looked at him, her eyes cold and distant. She sighed, clearly unwilling to meet his gaze for too long. "Nick, as much as I admire your brilliance and intelligence, you're too broke to take care of me. You don't have what I need." Nick's chest tightened. "What do you mean by that?" She leaned against the nearby wall, folding her arms with an air of finality. "Look around you, Nick. Edo State University isn't just a school, it's a playground for the rich boys, self-made, well-connected. They buy whatever they want, the best grades, the most expensive cars, the girls, everything. You're not going to get far with just your intelligence alone, not here." Nick felt the sting of her words, but he swallowed his pride. "So what do you want me to do? Just give up on everything I believe in? I've worked my whole life for this, Priska. You think all of this is just about money?" She shook her head. "I'm not saying you should give up, but you need to face reality. You've got to start thinking bigger. Take your lectures seriously, of course, but also figure out how the others do it. How they manage to come to school poor, and within months, they're driving flashy cars and throwing around cash like it's nothing. It's about survival here, Nick. The game is rigged. Money is the only thing that opens doors." Nick stood there in stunned silence. He felt his insides knotting as he processed her words. This wasn't the place he had hoped it would be. He had been so sure that his hard work would see him through, but now it felt like everything he had believed in was slipping through his fingers. Just as he was about to respond, the screech of tires interrupted them. A sleek black luxury car pulled up right in front of them. It was one of those high-end sports cars, the kind that made everyone stop and stare. Nick's gaze followed the car as the door swung open. A tall, well-built young man with dark sunglasses stepped out. He had a confident swagger, and his presence immediately commanded attention. He was known around the university as Chuka, a notorious bad boy who had earned a reputation for being able to sleep with almost every girl on campus. He had everything: money, power, and influence, and everyone knew it. Chuka barely glanced at Nick as he made his way to Priska. Without missing a beat, he cupped her face with one hand and kissed her passionately on the lips, ignoring Nick completely, as though he weren't even standing there. Nick stood frozen, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. He could feel his heart shattering as he watched the scene unfold. He had just heard the words from Priska that had rattled his sense of self-worth, but seeing her kiss Chuka in front of him without a single regard for him destroyed everything he thought he understood about relationships, dignity, and the world he had come to. Chuka pulled away from the kiss, smiling arrogantly. "Come on, babe," he said to Priska, his voice dripping with entitlement. "Let's get out of here. We've got more important things to do than standing around talking to broke guys like this." Without a word, Priska followed him, not even sparing Nick another glance. She climbed into the car, and just like that, Nick's entire world seemed to collapse. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his stomach turning as the car sped off, leaving nothing but the echoes of their laughter in the air. Nick felt a weight in his chest, as if the life had been drained from him. Everything he had believed in, every ideal he had held dear about working hard, staying true to himself, and earning success through perseverance, it all seemed meaningless now. The reality of the world around him had hit him harder than he could have ever imagined. As he stood alone in the empty parking lot, Nick realized that he was no longer just fighting for his future. He was fighting against a system that didn't care about brilliance, integrity, or hard work. It cared only about money, and no matter how much he fought, no matter how many sleepless nights he endured, it felt like that system was destined to crush him at every turn. Nick decided that enough was enough. He was tired of feeling insignificant, tired of watching his peers thrive while he struggled just to keep his head above water. Determined to understand how his classmates were making the leap from broke students to campus big shots, he resolved to find out their secrets. His first step was to summon the courage to approach Frank, one of his classmates. Frank was well known on campus, not just for his sharp fashion sense, but for the luxury car he drove and the influence he wielded. Frank never appeared to attend classes regularly, yet his grades were impeccable, and he seemed to have everything Nick lacked: money, connections, and respect. One afternoon, Nick found Frank sitting under a tree on campus, scrolling through his phone. Taking a deep breath, Nick approached him. "Frank, can I talk to you for a minute?" Frank glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "Nick, right? What's up?" Nick shifted nervously, scratching the back of his head. I really need your help. Can we talk somewhere private?" Frank smirked, intrigued. "Sure, come to my place this evening. I'll send you the address." Later that day, Nick arrived at Frank's off-campus apartment. It was in one of the most expensive areas near the school, a sleek, fully furnished flat with a large flat-screen TV, imported furniture, and a minibar stocked with expensive drinks. Nick felt a pang of envy as he stepped inside, wondering how someone his age could afford such luxury. Frank gestured for him to sit down. "All right, Nick, what's on your mind?" Nick hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Frank, I'm tired. I came to this school thinking my intelligence and hard work would get me somewhere, but it feels like none of that matters here. I see guys like you who seem to have it all: money, grades, respect. I want to know how you do it, how you made it." Frank leaned back in his chair, studying Nick with a faint smile. "So you want to become a campus big boy, huh?" Nick nodded earnestly. "I do. I've tried doing things the right way, but it's not working. I need your help." Frank sighed, his expression growing serious. "Nick, let me tell you something. This life isn't as glamorous as it looks. Sure, I've got the cars, the money, the girls, but it comes with a price most people aren't ready to pay. Are you sure you want this?" Nick nodded again, his resolve unwavering. "I'm sure. I've already made up my mind." Frank rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Listen, Nick, I admire your determination, but this path isn't for everyone. If you're not careful, it can destroy you. Why don't you just focus on your studies and keep pushing? Eventually, hard work pays off." Nick's jaw tightened. "Frank, I've been working hard my whole life, and look where it's gotten me. Nowhere." I don't want to waste any more time. Please, just show me the way. Frank sighed again, shaking his head. All right, if you're that determined, I'll help you. But remember, once you step into this world, there's no turning back. Are you ready for that? I am, Nick said firmly, his eyes blazing with determination. Frank studied him for a moment before nodding. Fine, come back here tomorrow night. I'll introduce you to some people who can help you get started. But Nick, be careful what you wish for. This life is not for the faint of heart. Nick left Frank's apartment that evening feeling a mix of excitement and apprehension. He knew he was about to step into uncharted territory, but his hunger for success had blinded him to the risks. All he could think about was the day he would no longer be overlooked or underestimated. Little did he know, the path he was about to take would test not only his resolve, but his very soul. The next day, Nick showed up at Frank's place as promised. His determination was written all over his face, but Frank still hesitated. He paced back and forth in his luxurious living room, clearly torn about what he was about to involve Nick in. Nick, listen to me, Frank said, stopping in front of him. You don't understand what you're asking for. This isn't some joke or a quick fix. Once you step into this life, there's no going back. I'm giving you one last chance to walk away. Nick shook his head firmly. Frank, I've made my decision. I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes to make it. I've been at the bottom for too long, and I'm tired of watching everyone else live a life I can only dream of. Please, just help me. Frank sighed deeply and ran a hand through his hair. All right, he said reluctantly, but don't say I didn't warn you. He grabbed his car keys. Let's go. The drive was tense and quiet, the night air heavy with an ominous feeling. Frank drove with a focused expression, barely saying a word. Nick, on the other hand, was a mix of nervousness and excitement. He didn't know what to expect, but his mind was too consumed with thoughts of finally breaking free from his struggles to consider the consequences. After about an hour, they reached a remote village on the outskirts of Edo. Frank pulled the car to the side of a dirt road and turned off the engine. From here we walk, he said, grabbing a flashlight from the glove compartment. Nick followed him as they made their way through a narrow path surrounded by dense trees. The silence of the night was broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves. After a while, they arrived at a small river. Frank stopped and pointed to the other side. We have to cross, he said, stepping into the shallow water. Nick hesitated for a moment before following. The cold water sent shivers up his spine, but he pressed on, determined to prove himself. On the other side of the river, they continued walking until they reached a clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old shrine, dimly lit by the flickering light of an oil lamp. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and Nick could feel his heart pounding in his chest. An elderly man dressed in traditional attire emerged from the shadows. His face was stern, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Frank, he said in a gravelly voice, you've brought someone new. Frank nodded respectfully. Yes, Baba, he's ready. The man turned to Nick, his piercing gaze making Nick feel small and vulnerable. Are you sure about this, boy? This is not a path you can walk halfway. Once you start, you must see it through to the end. Nick swallowed hard, but stood firm. I'm sure. I'll do whatever it takes. The old man studied him for a moment before nodding. Very well. Follow me. He led them into the shrine, where the air was thick with the smell of burning incense. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, and in the center of the room stood a large, ancient-looking idol. The old man's chant echoed louder, reverberating through the shrine like a haunting melody. Nick felt a chill run down his spine as the air thickened and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward him. The man stopped abruptly, his eyes locking on Nick with an intensity that made him feel as if his soul was being scrutinized. The price for what you want, the man said in a deep, guttural tone, is madness. Nick's heart skipped a beat. Madness, he repeated, his voice trembling. Yes, the man confirmed. For 7 days and 7 nights, you will roam the streets like a madman. The world will see your humiliation. Your hair must not touch water during this period, or you will remain mad forever. Nick's breath hitched, his hands trembling. This was far beyond anything he had imagined. The man continued, his voice unyielding. "If you survive these 7 days, unimaginable wealth and influence will be yours. But if you fail, the consequences will be eternal." Panic gripped Nick as the weight of the words settled in. This wasn't just a test, it was a trial by fire. Overwhelmed, he blurted out, "Jesus Christ of Nazareth!" The shrine erupted in chaos. A deafening thunderclap shook the walls, causing the ground to tremble beneath their feet. The oil lamp flickered wildly, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The old man's face twisted with rage. "How dare you mention that name here?" he bellowed, his voice thunderous. The atmosphere grew even darker, and his eyes burned with fury. "You have insulted this sacred ground," the man snarled. "For that, your punishment will increase. Your madness will now last 14 days instead of 7. Nick opened his mouth to plead, but before he could utter a word, the old man reached into a pouch and blew a handful of powder into his face. The powder stung his eyes and filled his nostrils with a pungent, choking smell. Nick staggered backward, clutching at his throat as a strange sensation overtook him. His body felt like it was on fire, his mind swirling with disjointed thoughts. He dropped to his knees, clawing at the air as an uncontrollable laughter bubbled up from his chest. Frank, standing in the corner, watched in horror. "Baba, are you sure about this?" he asked hesitantly. The old man shot him a withering glare. The boy made his choice. He must now pay the price. Nick's laughter turned to screams as he stumbled out of the shrine, tearing at his clothes. His mind felt like it was splitting apart, fragments of reality slipping away as madness consumed him. He ran blindly into the darkness, his shouts echoing through the night. Frank followed him at a distance, his face pale and his steps hesitant. As Nick disappeared into the shadows, Frank muttered under his breath, "I warned him. I told him this life isn't for everyone." Frank searched for Nick that night, his eyes scanning every corner of the village, his mind racing with worry. He could hear the echoes of Nick's screams in the distance, but every time he tried to approach, the darkness swallowed him up. It was as if Nick had disappeared into thin air. After hours of searching and growing increasingly worried, Frank returned home, exhausted and shaken. He said nothing about what had happened to anyone. He knew that what he had witnessed could not be easily explained. The madness that had taken over Nick seemed to consume him completely, and Frank feared that the boy might never return to his senses. Days passed without any sign of Nick. Frank tried to go about his daily life, but the guilt of what he had led Nick into hung heavy on him. He couldn't shake the image of Nick stumbling into the night, his mind lost to the ritual's madness. Then, one afternoon, as Frank was driving through campus, he saw something that stopped him dead in his tracks. There, by the side of the road, was Nick, his clothes ragged and torn, his hair wild, and his face covered in dirt. He was scavenging through a waste bin, pulling out food with a crazed look in his eyes. Frank's heart sank. He slammed on the brakes and jumped out of the car, calling Nick's name. "Nick! Nick, it's me, Frank!" Nick's head snapped up at the sound of his name, his eyes wide with a frantic gleam. The moment he saw Frank, something shifted in him. He let out a guttural growl, a feral sound that echoed through the quiet street. Without warning, he lunged at Frank, his hands reaching out as if to grab him. Frank recoiled in shock and stumbled back, barely managing to escape Nick's grasp. He turned and ran, panic rising in his chest as he heard Nick's frenzied footsteps behind him. Nick chased him with a speed and ferocity that seemed impossible, his eyes wild and unrecognizable. Frank ran as fast as he could, not daring to look back, knowing that if he slowed even for a second, Nick would catch him. When he finally reached his car, he scrambled inside, locking the door just in time. He watched in horror as Nick reached the car, slamming his hands against the windows, screaming and snarling in madness. But Nick didn't stop there. He began to run alongside the car, his pace quickening, matching Frank's speed. In a blur of motion, Nick veered off to the side, throwing himself into the street, forcing Frank to swerve sharply to avoid hitting him. He skidded to a stop, breathing heavily, his hands trembling on the steering wheel. Nick, on the other hand, was already running into the distance, his voice trailing behind him like a haunting wail. Frank couldn't bring himself to move. His mind was racing with disbelief and guilt. He could see the crowd gathering at a distance, students from the school who had witnessed the scene. As Frank watched the students approach Nick, he knew what was coming next. They tried to talk to him gently at first, but when Nick turned on them, his behavior only worsened. He growled and shrieked, pushing away anyone who tried to help him. The students, horrified, backed away, but Nick didn't relent. He continued to chase them, forcing them to retreat in fear. They realized it was impossible to help him. "He's lost," one of the students said quietly, watching Nick pace in circles, his eyes darting madly. "There's nothing we can do for him now." The others nodded in grim agreement. The look in Nick's eyes was one of pure madness, a reflection of the torment he had been through. They could only watch as he wandered aimlessly through the campus, an outcast from both society and sanity. One day, as Nick wandered aimlessly across the campus, Priska happened to see him. Her heart sank at the sight of the man he had become. Once a brilliant student, now reduced to a broken shell. She had once admired him for his intelligence and potential, but now, seeing him in such a sorry state, she couldn't help but feel pity. Despite everything that had happened, she felt a deep, unspoken sympathy for him. Determined to help, she devised a plan. She knew that Nick needed medical attention, but she also understood that no one in their right mind would agree to help him without some sort of intervention. She couldn't stand to see him like this any longer, so she decided to take action. She bought food, knowing how much Nick loved to eat when he was sane. But this time, she laced it with sleeping pills, knowing it would make him drowsy and fall asleep long enough for them to take him to a psychiatrist. She found him at the same spot, scavenging for food from the same waste bin. With a mix of kindness and calculated intent, she approached him. "Nick, I've got food," she called out gently. "Come and eat. Please, just come with me. I can help you." Nick's wild eyes met hers, but his mind was too far gone to process the meaning behind her words. He staggered toward her, drawn by the offer of food. His hand shook as he reached for the food, and Priska watched with a heavy heart as he devoured it without a second thought. Within minutes, Nick's eyes began to flutter, his body growing slack as the effects of the sleeping drugs took hold. Priska breathed a sigh of relief, and with the help of a few other students, they carefully maneuvered him to a secluded part of the campus where they could bathe him and prepare him for the psychiatrist. They cut his hair, his once thick, unruly hair that had been matted and filthy, and began to wash him, hoping to bring some semblance of normality back to his broken state. But as they poured water over his body, something unexpected happened. A heavy wind, violent and wild, suddenly swept through the area. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air seemed to grow heavier with every gust. The trees swayed violently, their branches creaking in protest. The very ground beneath them seemed to rumble. Priska and the students froze in place, panic seizing their hearts. They hadn't expected this. The wind seemed unnatural, as if it carried with it an ominous warning. The moment the water touched Nick's skin, an eerie chill filled the air. His body convulsed, and for a split second his eyes shot open, wide and unseeing, filled with an otherworldly madness. It was then that they realized their grave mistake. Nick's fate had been sealed the moment they decided to bathe him. The ritual had been clear. His hair could not touch water, or he would remain in his madness forever. The moment the water soaked into his hair, it was as if the final chain had been locked in place. The winds howled louder, the darkness growing thick around them, and a distant thunder rumbled ominously in the sky. Frank, who had been nearby, coming to see how Nick was doing, heard the wind pick up. His heart skipped a beat as he rushed toward the scene, a feeling of dread creeping into his chest. He was too late. He arrived just in time to see Nick's body convulsing, his eyes wide and glazed, a tortured expression on his face. Frank's worst fear had come to pass. He watched in horror as Priska and the others scrambled to try and stabilize Nick, unaware of the consequences of their actions. He knew what they didn't. The water had sealed Nick's fate. "Stop!" Frank shouted, rushing toward them. "What have you done?" Priska looked up in confusion. "Frank? What are you—" "Don't touch him," Frank pleaded, panic rising in his voice. "You don't understand. He can't touch water, his madness. It's permanent now. The ritual. It's all been undone." But it was too late. The wind howled even louder, the skies darkening as if the heavens themselves were condemning their actions. Nick's body trembled violently, as if the very essence of his being was being torn apart. Why didn't you warn us?" one of the students asked, her voice trembling with fear. Frank's face was pale, his chest tight with guilt and fear. "I never thought you would do this. I thought we could undo it. I didn't know it would be like this. Now he's doomed to wander forever in madness."